Hello, I'm Adam Hardy and I've been given the subject of evolution of Indian temples. Evolution. We have to be a bit careful here because temples are not plants, they're not animals, they're not organisms adapting to their environment, and we mustn't see any particular temple as something that's inevitably leading on to some other temples, surely. After all, temples and their architecture are human creations. Despite this necessary caution, when we look broadly at the whole picture of Indian temple architecture across the centuries and its traditions, a very characteristic way of developing does stand out, which has its own way of growth, of unfolding, of blossoming. So it is something like organic natural evolution. But let's be clear, this quasi-organic pattern of development is a gradual transformation of architectural forms. It's a formal pattern, not one that explains, for example, what is perhaps the most obvious transformation in the history of Indian temple architecture, the one from wood to stone. Neither is it easy on the whole to find continuous patterns of change in structural developments, beams, corbelling and so on. In the planning of temples there's much variety, and plans do of course develop along with ritual and other functional needs. But the spectacular patterns of unfolding I want to show you are principally in architectural forms. And above all in the shrine itself, the vimana, the prasada. That is what the Sanskrit canonical texts on architecture, the Vastu Shastras, conceive as the temple form. In an earlier talk, we looked at different forms of temple, at their typology, their classification. We saw how 5 early shrine forms made of wood became the prototypes, the seeds of later temple architecture, how the early forms were transformed into masonry, and how this was an architecture of imagery, of representation, and how the combination of types to create new types was a basic principle of design. It's hard to talk about these typologies separately from their development, the way in which things change. These are dynamic, creative typologies. There are some traditions where the organic and emanatory character of evolution is especially conspicuous, notably the Nagara tradition across northern India and the Dravida tradition, the Dravida as it developed in Karnataka and the Deccan. I want also in this talk to qualify this idea and take account of traditions which seem not to develop so much in this way, which are perhaps more static, where we have to take account of outside influences and sometimes of revivals of earlier forms. Nevertheless, the more growth-like pattern is very widespread and conspicuous. It's a pattern that's intimately connected to a way of designing. The temple architects draw out new designs from those already established in such a way that the earlier, simpler forms are still present within the later and more complicated ones. There's a lot of invention, a lot of creative experiment and variation, and yet if we stand back and look at the broad picture, we see the unfolding of the tradition following a logic of emanation, of one form coming out of another, a sequential logic. And it's this sequential logic that makes certain forms in retrospect seem inevitable, as if they've grown out of what went before. This pattern of growth, this proliferation, this progression from one to many, unity to multiplicity, is of course a cultural human phenomenon, not a natural one, but nevertheless it does seem to reflect deep-rooted and recurrent ideas in Indian philosophy, theology and mythology about how nature works, about the creation of the universe, which often is understood as something manifested through a sequence of emanations. Take the myth of Vishnu Ananta Shayin. Vishnu reclines on the serpent of endlessness in the cosmic ocean between one dissolution and recreation of the universe. A lotus emerges from his navel and grows, and from the lotus emerges the god Brahma, who proceeds to create the universe. So one thing comes out of another, emerges from another, and another from that, and another from that. Take the Lingodabhava myth, the origin of the linga. In the cosmic void, Vishnu and Brahma are arguing about who's the greatest god, when from the void emerges and grows the shape of the linga. An orifice appears in its side, and out of the void in the linga emerges and grows the terrible form of Shiva. Brahma, taking the form of the boar, dives down to try to find the bottom of the linga. Brahma, in the form of a bird, flies up to try to find the top, but ever, the linga is expanding. So, again, something comes out of something comes out of that, things emerge and they grow. In the case of the sculpture on the right, we've got the device of the split pilaster, which gives another layer of emerging form. Let's now look at the different traditions of temple architecture, starting with the Dravida of South India, and with the way it develops in the far south in Tamil Nadu. The simplest form is an Alpa Vimana, a simple Vimana. It comes in various shapes, and it goes back to wooden shrines crowned by a domed kuta or a barrel-roofed shala. This form is classified as ekatala or one tala or story. But nevertheless, conceptually, there are two stories, as the kuta or the shala has its own symbolic floor, represented in a moulding, the Vyala Mala or Prati, supporting a symbolic railing and balcony below the roof. The type with a kuta on top is most typical. This becomes the superstructure of a dvitala form, and then kutas and shalas are placed along the parapet, and you can put pilasters underneath those with projections, and you have a series of temple forms embedded within the body of a whole, the original Alpa Vimana remaining at the top of the temple. One tala, 2, 3, and so far you can see how one temple form is unfolding from another. Another kind of 3 with a different number of projections, 4 talas, 5, and you can have more. And variety is created by different arrangements of Kuta, Shala and Panjara. But this tradition in Tamil Nadu is not a good example of continuous progressive development. The basic range of options is there from quite an early date, and it's only in certain periods where it's usual to have temples of more than 3 or 4 talas. The great imperial Chola temples of the 11th and 12th centuries are exceptional in having a large number of talas. The Brihadishvara temple at Tanjavur having the most with 14. It also happens to be the biggest. Later Vimanas tend to be relatively simple and relatively small. It is the gopuras or gateways that tend to get more and more talas and to get bigger and bigger. The planning of temple complexes, however, does broadly follow a pattern of expansion. There tend to be more and more prakaras or enclosure walls, sometimes built all at one time, sometimes one after another, as well as taller and taller gopuras as you move to the exterior of the temple. After around the 13th century, in these temple complexes of the far south of India, invention and variety are in the planning of the complex and in new kinds of structure within the compound, rather than in the design of the shrine itself, the Vimana. Incidentally, the tallest ever gopuram was built only a few years ago here at Srirangam. And still today we find the very simplest of shrine forms. If we compare the Dravida tradition of the far south with that of Karnataka, at least until it was interrupted around the 13th century, we see that from similar early stages emerge a continuing unfolding. It's a classic emanatory progression. The crucial element is the Bhadra, the central projection, with the Shala-topped edicule or temple image. Around the end of the 9th century, they have the idea of emphasizing the concept of a Panjara-topped shrine at the center, so that these two ends emerge sideways, like that. And having done that, early in the 11th century, why not go a stage further and do that? So in effect, what we get is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 Shala-topped temple images interpenetrating and emerging and expanding out one from another. It looks like this. At the same time, similar transformations are happening in the plan of the Vimana as a whole, starting from a square, getting projections, then stepping out projections in increasing number, so the whole wall and body of the temple is bulging forth. The central nasi or horseshoe arch of the Shala emerges from the jaws of a monster finial. Similarly, the horseshoe arches on the ends have their own monster faces with snail-like bodies sitting on the ridge of the Shala. So why not add some more emerging, spewing out arches? Face, arch, cascading down the faces of the tower. At the centre of the Shala we have a nasi or horseshoe arch, And this is spewed out from the jaws of a monster finial. Similarly, the end gables of the Shala, also horseshoe arches, have their own monster heads on top. And those have snail-like bodies riding along the ridge of the Shala. Having had that idea, why not go further? Why not have a face, an arch, a face, an arch, another one, blah, 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 cascading down the sides of the tower. Earlier types continue to be built, but sink down the hierarchy of temple forms through a kind of inflation. The lateral shrines here in this triple temple would have been the latest thing a few decades before. They have 3 projections and 3 talas. Now the grandest type is the one in the centre with 5 projections and 4 talas. Notice how the kutas and shalas, the edicules, now run all the way up to the neck of the temple. So the original Alpa Vimana form is no longer visible at the top. At a certain stage, the makaras, which are the floor joists of the Shala, which previously had been orthogonal, go diagonal, especially on the corners. First like that, then tuk, 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 tuk. At the same time, the previously orthogonal end gables of the Shala also go diagonal, with monsters with their faces split down the middle and the arches going like that. So the walls are bulging progressively out, you get diagonal forces from within, and you get the uniform stellate plan. Of course, a huge variety of Vimana designs was created at any one time, but if we stand back and look at the overall picture across the centuries and at the most complex temple types typical at the different stages, this is the pattern that we see. Dravida temples continuously transformed, and at some indefinable moment becoming the kind of temple often known as the Vesara. And all the while the architectural mouldings representing thatched eaves, floors, railings and so on are gradually and continuously abstracted and elaborated further and further away from their timber origins. What better illustration that evolution doesn't mean increasing size? Don't imagine that all this increasing complexity means bigger and bigger temples. Many of these elaborate works are actually quite small, and the miniature Vimana designs in the temple walls are even smaller. Like the Sanskrit texts, these wall shrines can repeat existing temple types, but they can also invent new permutations, which might be built later, or sometimes are extraordinarily amazing designs that have never been realized at full size. It's striking to see how in this tradition, at least until it was adopted by the Hoysalas, increasing multiplicity of wall surfaces is clearly driven by purely architectural preoccupations, unlike many other traditions where architectural complexity goes hand in hand with elaboration of iconographic schemes. Which brings us on to the Nagara traditions of northern India. In the talk on temple classification, I explained how, from the Gupta period onwards, an emanating development, an unfolding transformation, led on from multi-edicular proto-Nagara forms to fusion into the unitary Latina mode of Nagara temple with its curved shikhara. Latina temples get projections, and then projections with recesses in between in increasing numbers, and then more and more bhumis or levels in the shikhara. Meanwhile, the closely related Vallabhi mode of Nagara temple is developed in parallel ways. We see this in Vallabhi temples themselves, also in the Shukhanasas of Latina temples, the projecting thing in front, and in the many Vallabhi wall shrines. The horseshoe arch or Gavaksha form, so crucial to the Vallabhi mode, evolves through abstraction further and further away from its timber origins. And meanwhile, the combinations of these forms in Vallabhi temples and pediments also evolve from the idea of the single with the two halves Chaitya hall cross-section comes the implication of a split, something else coming through, more splitting and emerging Gavakshas, and then you get a whole kit of parts made out of whole, half and fused Gavakshas, which you can put together in a whole variety of different ways. The Gavaksha motif gets abstracted, moving further and further away from its timber origins and becoming more and more linear and curvaceous. While the Gavaksha configurations proliferate into unfurling cascades. Once the temple architects have seemingly exhausted the possibilities of the Latina, a new cycle begins. Composite Anekandaka forms appear, leading to the Shekhari mode of Nagara temple. Between the 10th and 12th centuries, the architects draw out an emanating sequence of progressively complex forms. Once again, earlier forms are contained within the later ones, and moreover, these earlier forms continue to be built, but have a lower place in the hierarchy of temple types. The starting point is the unitary Latina shrine, from which emerge 4 images of the same thing. And at the corners, little shikharas on pillars, kuta stambhas, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. In typical fashion, one form becomes the top of a more complicated one. So you have 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, This in turn becomes the top of a yet more complicated form, where you have 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, 3, 4, then and you can see the whole thing is expanding upwards and unfolding downwards. As the centre has been pushing forward, the corner projections have gone into line with the intermediate projections so that you have a stepped diamond plan, which gives the possibility of a very dense interpenetration of kuta stamba elements across the diagonals, interpenetrating, embedded in one another. At a certain stage, we get a new element, as well as the half shikaras, we get quarter shikaras or pratyangas, so that we have 4 emerging out of 1, and then at this level 1, 2, 3, conceptually 4. The pattern of 4 emerging from 1 is repeated or mirrored 1 level down on the 4 faces. And one step further, the unfolding of the tradition is there in the expression of movement in the single temple, emerging and expanding downwards and outwards at the same time as expanding upwards. Before that proliferation of the smaller parts, the great Kandariya Mahadeva temple at Khajuraho has reached just about as far as you can go already in the 11th century. From the central shikara emerge 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, Urashringas. And it's devised in such a way that you get quarter shikaras, pratyangas, at 2 levels. So the pattern of 4 emerging from 1 happens 3 times on each side at different levels. In the dynamics of the single temple are encapsulated the stages of unfolding of the tradition. This is how the Kandariya Mahadeva actually is. And this is where it all appears to be going, as the individual entities in the very process of appearing are already on their way back to dissolution into an undifferentiated unity. Once the tradition has evolved just about as far as it can go along a certain path, there's still room for proliferation in the parts. The Kuta Stambhas, formerly simply Latina, become composite temple designs in themselves. The babies have babies. A similar kind of development happens to the roofs of mandapas, beginning in Western India. Previously Vamsana, these roofs become a composite form called Samvarana. The basic unit is like this, and the bare bones of its unfolding are like this. To flesh it out, it looks like this. Under a roof like that, you'll find a beautiful corbelled ceiling like this. Again, it's a development that begins in Western India and soon spreads to Central India and beyond. The basic unit of these corbelled ceilings, though flower-like, is actually a stone representation of the underside of a thatched dome with radiating wooden ribs. It grows lobes and blossoms like this. This is the centre of this. And it further burgeons into this and fluoresces into patterns like this. Babies have babies, lobes have lobes. All these emanating sequences are within the Nagara tradition, But now I must again point out that, not surprisingly, not everything evolves in this way. The distinctive tradition of Odisha, Orissa, is characterized by transformations wrought by waves of influences which become absorbed. In the 7th century, mainstream early Nagara influence came from central India, and you get Latina temples like this and Vallabhi temples like this. Two new kinds of Vallabhi characterize further waves of influence. Early in the 8th century, influence from Dakshina Kosala, what I would call the Varata tradition, gives you this. And early in the 10th century, influence from somewhere to the south gives you a kind of Dravida language, and Vallabhi temples look like this. This southern influence infuses the entire tradition, as here at the Mukteshwara temple, which has one of those kinds of Vallabhi as its centerpiece. Some renewed central Indian influence is coming in at the same time, which you also see in the Mukteshwara. This new central Indian influence is especially conspicuous at the Rajrani temple, Bhubaneswar, which of course, as you'll see, is a Shekari temple. As an aside, I want to quickly show you a lovely idea it embodies. There it is, the Rajrani. It contains one of these Shekari temples right in the middle, which of course itself contains one of them. But to return to our lightning tour of Odishan temple development, they aren't very keen on this three-dimensionality. They quickly return to frontality. And later Odishan temples exhibit the traces of all the various influences I've just shown you. Going back to the mainstream Nagara tradition of central and western India, by the end of the 12th century, continuous evolution had in certain ways exhausted the formal possibilities of one cycle and development. This was also the moment when continuity was being disrupted by invasions. These also brought new kinds of influence and new kinds of hybridization. Craft lineages specialized in building temples also began to apply their skills to building mosques. Islamic influences affected temples. By the 17th century in Rajasthan, it was Mughal influences that were mixing with Nagara forms. In central India, temples could look extremely Mughal, or in other cases, Mughal elements could mix with vernacular forms and vernacular interpretations of older Nagara elements. In Bengal, from around the 16th century, a new language of temple architecture was created from regional vernacular forms mixed with the by now established Bengali Islamic architectural tradition. In 18th century Maharashtra under the Marathas, it was earlier Bhumija temples that inspired them, interpreted in a beautiful folkish kind of way, heavily influenced by Deccani Islamic elements, as here on the left at Ellora, or, as around Nagpur on the right, by Mughal Rajput features, as in this lovely two-story mini facade with cusped arches that runs around the temple walls. Here at Ramtek, Mughal pavilions, Deccani Islamic onion domes, and interpretations of Nagara and Bhumija jostle together. In many of these examples, temple forms seem to have been adopted through imitation of earlier monuments and through reinvention, more than through continuity and survival of the craft tradition. Even where, as here, the temples at first sight seem to be rather close to Nagara forms. In Gujarat and Rajasthan, however, although temple building more or less ceased during the 14th century, when it was mosque building that kept alive the craftsman's knowledge, every century since the 15th century has witnessed vigorous spurts of temple building. Much of it's been patronized by Jain merchants or Rajput rulers, and more recently by temple community trusts. It's therefore quite difficult in these regions to draw a clear line between revival and survival of the Nagara tradition. During these periods of renewed temple building, earlier medieval types have often been repeated, but the architects have nevertheless managed to draw out or squeeze out further degrees of complexity from the formal system that their forebears created. This example is from the 15th century. It's at Polo in Gujarat. It develops the idea that I showed you in the Rajarani temple. One of those at the middle of one of those, at the middle of one of those, which in turn is taken a stage further and is the middle of that. Notice the two sizes of quarter shikara. That particular type reappears at various times, sometimes with a lovely folkish, or shall we say non-classical character. A drawing of the type with instructions appears in the Shilpa Ratnakar, a Gujarati and Sanskrit text of 1939, a text that's played a big part in the renewal of the Nagara tradition by the Sompura lineage of temple architects in Western India. On the right, we see a rather flattened version of the type in a Jain temple built quite recently at Vadnagar. And so it all goes on. Birla temples, Sompura temples, all kinds of temples. Finally, what do the canonical texts have to say about all this? Do they say there is a characteristic emanatory pattern underlying the development of temples in India? Of course they don't say that, but they do reflect that pattern in their organic way of thinking about temple designs. It has to be admitted that some texts have this quality more than others do, just as we have found, looking at the built record, that some traditions have it more than others. But some texts are pretty explicit. One part of the Samarangana Sutradhara actually talks about a set of temples being a kula, a family, a clan, a lineage. It says that these temples have sons, grandsons, and great-grandsons. Babies having babies again. Texts reflect the emanatory way of thinking in two ways. Firstly, they evolve along with the temple architecture with which they deal. And secondly, they typically present temples in sequences running from simple to complex, each form drawn out from the one before. A good example of both these phenomena is a sequence of 25 temples starting with the Kesari. And it seems that the earliest surviving example of this text is the 11th century Samarangana Sutradhara. It's in chapter 56. It begins with the Kesari, which is like the temple on the left. And this moves on to a second form where the Kesari becomes the top of a more complicated form called the Sarvatobhadra. The Kesari temple has 5 andakas, that is 5 armlakas on top of Shikhara forms. The Sarvatobhadra has 9, and so it continues, adding 4 andakas each time until you reach the Meru temple, the 25th, which has 101 andakas. Existing types are ingeniously combined to create new ones as we go along. A series of 25 temples with the same names, starting with Kesari, appears in a number of later texts. The Aparajita Prucha is a Western Indian text of around the 12th century. That's a century or so later than the Samarangana Sutradhara. Its Kesari series is chapter 159. If we follow the instructions in that chapter, we find that the first 2 temples, the Kesari and the Sarvatobhadra, are essentially the same design as the ones in the Samarangana. After the first 2, the Aparajita Pracha soon departs from its predecessor. The Indranila temple is number 13 of the series and has 53 andakas. In the Samarangana Sutradhara, it's one of the less well-resolved designs, if I've interpreted it correctly. But in any case, it has a simple staggered square plan with 16 padas or parts. And in the superstructure, it has only ura shringas, that is half shikharas, no quarter shikharas or pratyangas. In the Aparajita Pracha, the Indranila has a staggered square plan, that is the corner and the intermediate projections are all in line. Again has 16 parts to the plan, 16 squares. And in the superstructure, it has a fine set of pratyangas. It's a variant of this, typical of the 12th century. The Kesari series has caught up with the times. In later examples of the sequence, the initial Kesari is the same basic idea, but already the Sarvatobhadra is different. It still develops from 5 to 9 andakas, but uses a different way of achieving it. In each text, this sequence of design evolves, unfolding from the Kesari to the Meru. And if we examine the sequence in different texts from different dates, we see that the designs in the texts change with the evolving tradition. I could have used Bhumija temples as an example of a mode that doesn't really evolve. The reason being that it was invented around the turn of the 11th century. Its theory was worked out at the same time. The key text here is chapter 65 of the Samarangana Sutradhara. The forms in the tradition don't evolve because the basic principles are evident from the start. But this doesn't mean that the text doesn't reflect an emanatory sequential way of thinking. It does so very clearly, and it illustrates how there can be different kinds of sequential logic. Here it is not a physical bodying forth of one form from another, but a very rigorous arithmetical and geometrical logic through which one type succeeds another. The text gives instructions for 4 square types, 7 star-shaped or stellate types, and 5 more stellate types with 8 bhadras or shalas. The number of turned squares in the star-shaped plan is determined by the geometrical properties emerging from a procedure called parivartana, going around the circle. And the designs encapsulated in the text are the various permutations resulting from this process. So, while there is little evolution traceable in the built forms, the text reveals how the forms have nevertheless been generated through a process of development. Several of the theoretical possibilities were never realized in practice. Looking at Indian temple architecture as a whole across long periods, a pattern of successively emanating forms, growing, proliferating, emerging one from another, stands out forcefully as a characteristic kind of evolution. This way of unfolding implies a way of designing by which temple architects gradually and collectively extrapolate the formal potential of a tradition. The fertility of the formal system perhaps evoked a sense that a temple design was inevitable, self-creating, and that its ultimate source was suprahuman and divine. Vastu Shastra texts must have contributed to this sense that temple designs would manifest themselves from some mysterious source. We can imagine how the making of a temple and the evolution of temples within a tradition would be understood and experienced as part of a natural cosmic process. Is there still creative potential in the traditions we've been looking at? As an architect, I would say certainly yes, but I wouldn't presume to say that there's only one way to be inspired by them. But I am certain that the traditions of Indian temple architecture are such beautiful creations of human culture that they merit looking at very closely. And looking is the whole point. Different people will have understood what I've said differently and interpreted it differently. That's inevitable. The main point is to see. Showing dynamic things in static images can be hard, which is why computer animation is a useful thing. I was involved a few years ago in making one for the British Museum. It's called Emanating Temple Forms, and you can find it on the internet. I'm going to end with a small snip of it. It shows the unfolding of a tradition. At the same time, it shows the expression of movement, of emerging, expanding, proliferating forms in a single temple. It shows evolution from one to many, on the way to dissolution back into unity. And it shows how creation is cyclical, and that every end contains a new beginning.